Shuck by Rebecca Lloyd. I wondered if it was sheer perversity that made Liz decide to move to Thrubend Edge, a way of saying that living alone was such an unnatural thing to do, that the place she tried it in must be truly abject to reflect the fact. She'd made the decision in one of her periods of serenity, having accepted reluctantly that life was not a lesser thing without a lover, although I'm sure she never really believed it. I'd driven through the horrible place from time to time on business trips. It was a backwater settlement, all boldly laid out on a forgotten road through an agricultural landscape with few trees. Whether or not Liz was in one of her rational phases, moving to Thrubend Edge only suggested that her bad choices were not confined to the more frightening aspects of her illness. She'd hardly been gone 6 months before she told me she needed me up there badly, and she'd already involved our mother, who said, "She's your twin, Erica. She only wants your approval, and it was you who said there was nothing wrong with living alone in the first place." I looked away from her face in time to avoid the particular movement of her round, pale eyes that would have me think of reptilian things. "Well, it was you, wasn't it?" she asked, frowning as I stepped back from her. "Yes, and that's because there isn't anything wrong with it." "There may not be for you, who has become so hardened, but there is nothing natural about it for normal women." "Like Liz, you mean?" "Oh, you couldn't resist that, could you, Erica? That's so cheap. I despair of you sometimes," she said. "I try as hard as I can to encourage Liz to make friends with sensible women in the hope it might help her get better. And you, sometimes I wonder who really is." We had met halfway down the garden, and at this point we moved on, she to the greenhouse, and I onwards into the dark kitchen of the family house. We both knew through experience the depth of hostility that could so quickly rise between us around anything to do with Liz. Mum had never relinquished the notion of bad genes passed on by our father, and in her more agitated moments would bring it up again, even though Liz and I were identical, and I did not share her madness. But for the most part, our mother ricocheted between a savage denial of the illness to a smothering protectiveness of Liz, in which she both expected and rejected my support at the same time. "Elizabeth says she's made a lot of friends up there, and it's not all cold and flat like people say. She's a very sociable girl, you know, if only she's given a chance. You could learn a lot from your sister in that regard, Erica," she'd told me at breakfast that morning. "I've already said I'll go this weekend, Mum," I replied. Mother's anguish about the illness was as expressive as the thing itself, and I never knew from one moment to the next what she'd say about it. Sometimes she'd confuse us and call us both mad. At other times we were both sane, but wayward. She searched out aspects of my own life that struck her as odd, to offset Liz's extremes, and I grew used to being a conduit for her anxiety. "At least Liz does try to be friendly, which is more than can be said for you, Erica. Besides, standing on the roof of that travel lodge like that was her way of saying how much she loved that man. I thought it very imaginative." "Yes, it was, wasn't it?" I murmured. "I'll go and see her. Take her something nice." "It's not her fault she got all the imagination genes. She'll find a man someday who isn't frightened of her." "I just said I'd go, Mum." "There'll be a man out there for her somewhere," she insisted, as if saying the words out aloud could cause it to be so. "Which is more than can be said for me?" I prompted, smiling at her stiffly. "Well, I'm glad you're going, Erica. Sisters should look after each other. Anyway, she says it's a lovely place, and I've got the feeling she's already met somebody up there. She's all dreamy on the phone." Thrubend Edge had a look about it close up, that suggested it had come together by happenstance and yet had been there forever. It had a church whose grimy steeple poked rudely upwards at the sky, a tiny store and a derelict scout hut, and then a single row of red brick council houses, all grim-faced against the wind that growled across the landscape the whole time. Liz's house was close to an abandoned chicken farm, overlooking a vast chalky field with a wide drainage ditch in front of it. The walk from the station was a lengthy one, and I wished I'd started the journey earlier, for the night was rotten black, and had me so nervous that I became convinced I'd never find the place at all. I started back twice, as if my intention to reach the house had been overruled by some deeper, half-formed knowledge, but I forced myself to turn about and face the long, dark way again. I was aware, all the time, of the slimy drainage ditch on my right, and I kept to the far verge, away from it. The field beyond looked newly ploughed, and the soil, heavily furrowed, was aglint with gleaming white chalk. Finally, I came to the house. A horrible place, with stretches of raw breeze block and broken wire fencing. "The road's much longer at night," Liz said, looking out at me through the open front door from halfway down the shadowy hall. "You should have come at a decent time. I made mince with carrot pieces for lunch, because that's when I thought you were coming. Now it's cold." "I did tell you when I'd be here, Liz." "Nobody ever comes up and down this road at night anyway. You should have taken the taxi from the station." "I didn't see a taxi, otherwise I would have. Thanks for leaving the door open for me. You didn't have to. It's been open all day. We've been waiting. Nobody walks down this road in the dark." "Yes, you said that. Is it a Roman road? It never seemed to end." "Much older, they say. One of those tracks humans made at the beginning of time. People have drowned in that ditch, apparently. People say it's bottomless." "Oh, I kept well away from it, Liz." "Well, anyway, you look awful." "Tired, is all." "You haven't even asked me if I'm all right." "Are you all right, Liz?" "More or less, since you happened to ask, Eric." "Can I come in? I'm beginning to feel cold now." I tried to shake off the last flitting remnants of fear that had been so powerfully with me once I got beyond the train station. "It's extraordinarily remote here, I must say," I remarked. Liz laughed and took my bag from me. "Oh, to you it would seem remote, I expect," she said. "You have to be a certain kind of person to really appreciate the subtlety of it. I made us mincemeat and carrot pieces for dinner, so you better like them." For the first couple of days, I thought about nothing but the nastiness of Liz's house, with its flimsy doors and vicious draughts. The wallpaper had patterns of cornucopias that struck out from its surface in silver swirling ridges. The same wallpaper was in all the rooms, including the poky kitchen where it was beginning to peel off. I checked the fridge. She had plenty of food, and Mother was sending her money regularly, and so I tried to dismiss my sense that things were not right with her at all. It was September and cold, but she never closed the front door, and I wore my coat in the house most of the time. Then I began to notice a deep and unusual watchfulness in her. I'd come across her staring through the front window at the field's horizon, as if in a trance, and there was something about the rigidity of her posture that made me know she normally lingered there for hours. "What are you thinking about, Liz?" I asked. "I'm waiting. I want you to see something. That's why I asked you to come. Watch with me." "What are we waiting for?" "You'll know when you see it." The clouds were massing with horrible intensity, and a promise of deadly cold rain, and the great undulating field across the road was dotted with rooks. "Are you really okay here?" I asked. and pushed her hair back over her shoulder. She shuddered almost imperceptibly, but I felt it. "You're looking restless." "I'm fine. I haven't had any episodes for a long time now. Unless this new way of thinking is part of it all. I need you to tell me what you think yourself, since you're my twin. Tell me if it's mad or not." "New way of thinking?" "It's to do with him. I see what I see about him, yet I know something else, and the something else doesn't belong in ordinary life." I took up position by her side, so that she couldn't see my expression properly, were she to look at me. "Who are you talking about?" I asked, knowing she wasn't going to say anything else unless I prized it out of her, and I'd long since given up playing that particular game with Liz. "I'm going to walk around outside for a bit," I said. "Are you coming?" I looked for signs of another person as I went. An extra coat on the door, a man's boots, but could only see the flotsam and jetsam I was familiar with in my sister's life, her endless knickknacks. She joined me at the gate, shuffling along the weedy path in her slippers, and there she waited for me to question her, moving a stone about with her foot. Instead, I asked, "Has Mum been up here yet?" "No, it's too far for her to come. Anyway, I don't want her. You know what she's like. I just want to show you something." "Well, here I am, Liz. I'm not alone, you know. You might think I am, but I'm not. I thought that's what you came to Norfolk for. So when you got old, you'd be all practiced at not being dependent on someone else in life. Mum doesn't think it's a good idea for me to be alone." "Yes, I know. She never stops telling me. And that's partly why I decided to try it out, to show her I could. She smothers me." "I'm aware of it," I answered. "She blames me for your moving, probably." "Yeah, but you're not really interested one way or the other, Eric. I can tell." I felt a quick familiar flare of anger. This was one of her old games in which, by magic manipulation, she would hand over the responsibility for what she said to the one who questioned her. "So interest me then, Liz." She laughed. "Well, there's alone and alone, you see." The rooks rose suddenly, making no noise as they moved towards the single tree on the field's horizon. "What does that mean, Liz?" "It means he's only here sometimes, if he's really here at all. I want you to see him. He's either here or not here. We've been through things like this before. That's why I wanted you to come up, to tell me if he is or isn't." "Let's have it then. Who is he? Tall, dark stranger type?" "You could say that. Very attentive," she said. "Gets you in his gaze." "Where did you find him? Barn dance or something?" "He came across that field." "And you looked at each other, and it was true love, again?" "In a manner of speaking." "What were you doing in the field?" "I was here, by the gate. I thought he'd come out of the ditch, but I mustn't have been looking." "What's his name?" "Finn." I turned to look at her. Her face was flushed, and her hair hung long and glorious. "So when do I meet him?" "Tomorrow, maybe. I need you to help me. I want to know exactly where he goes when he's not with me." "Well, ask him, why don't you?" She shook her head. "I don't want to say anything else right now. You'll see when you see." "It sounds like one of your obsessions." "Possession, more like. I'm bound to him. Liz, I'm not going to lecture you again because you've heard it all before. You don't understand. What he does isn't right. I want you to witness it for me. Finn's not why you came up here. We talked about it. You've got to stick to your purpose. You're trying to break the futile cycle of always being dependent on some bloody man, aren't you? She sighed and turned back to the house. I followed close behind her. He's not really a man, she said, quite suddenly, and stopping on the path. The exact same thing you said about all of them. Only he doesn't seem to be what he should be either. I feel strange around him. I don't want to say anything else in case it blurs your idea of him. When do I meet the boy? He comes in at any old time. There's no rhyme or reason to it. He's a dog, Eric. Well, that's not right. He isn't really. For Christ's sake, Liz, are you saying he treats you badly? What a surprise that would be. Not exactly. But then I'm not sure I know what bad means anymore. Sometimes I feel so safe that I know it's unnatural. Then other times I feel singled out. It's horrible. I can't describe it. I can't do anything about it. Things might change if he settled down a bit. If ever he could, that is. Finn came in the late afternoon, just before the gathering of dusk, and I was completely silenced by the look of him. I hadn't been aware he was there when he first arrived, yet the front room was tiny. Liz and I were in the kitchen peeling potatoes, and the door was ajar. She put her knife down and turned around slowly. "I thought so," she whispered. "He's arrived and gone to his usual place." I turned my chair around and stared into the other room. "What are you talking about, Liz?" "There, look. Just inside the front room door." "Where?" "Don't be silly, Erica. Just inside the door on the right, against the wall. Look down." I did see him then, for a brief moment. Although to this day I don't recall how clearly. The room was mottled with shadow. I remember only a brutal surge of repulsion welling up in me at the sight of something crouching, and Liz tugging at my arm. "He's not looking at you, so don't stare like that. He's here for me." "Why didn't you tell me what to expect?" I whispered, and even as I spoke, I was no longer sure I had seen him. "I didn't want you to be influenced by me. Thank God you can see him anyway. I thought you'd say you couldn't," Liz said. "And I did tell you. You just weren't listening." "How long?" I whispered. "Has he been coming here?" "Couple of months now." I stared into the front room, looking to see if he'd moved position, or if he'd gone entirely from my sight. He'd been huge and muscled, and black as night. And as he crouched there, everything about the house felt changed, drawn inwards, suffocating. I got up from the table, moving my chair back quietly, and finding a glass by the sink, dribbled some water into it, trying to be noiseless. "So, what do you think?" my sister asked. "How do you see him?" "Did he see me?" Liz shrugged. "Why shouldn't he have? Is he dangerous?" I saw her shoulders droop. "I never thought of that," she said quietly. "Why do you always have to think of the very worst thing, Eric?" "You should come home with me tomorrow," I said. "Not stay here any longer. You haven't told me. How do you see him, Eric?" I thought for a moment. "I don't anymore. But he was unearthly," I said. "Colossal. He takes off and is gone instantly sometimes. I couldn't keep up with him even if I tried. Could you find out where he goes?" "Hell no." "Please, Erica, all I need you to find out is if he's mine or not, because I am surely his." "And you can't do that for yourself?" "I'm afraid I'd get in a tangle." "Why don't you come home with me tomorrow? There's a morning train, isn't there? I've no idea how this has happened, what it is, what it means, but you can't stay here anymore." "Other people in the village know about Finn too," she said. "It's not just me, in case you were thinking it is." I thought of the time Liz was convinced that men could get through a crack in her window pane, and how she kept a spoon under her mattress to fight them, in case they came in at night. I'd grown used to that kind of thing, but now, for the first time, I felt truly terrified of being her twin. I thought a portal had opened up between us, that I'd accidentally blundered through into the mire of her splintered mind. Yet, as we stood together in the kitchen, each staring at the other, into our own face, my journey along the way seemed, in its sudden assault on my memory, to have distinctly heralded the coming of Finn. Before the night was through, I'd promised my sister I'd go into the village the next morning and try to find out what was known about our visitor and where he went. But in truth, I simply needed to put a little distance between me and her, to have been able to see what she saw, if only for a second or so, had shocked me deeply. I had for many years been grateful that although I was physically identical, I was mentally utterly different. I was glad when I could leave her and creep up the stairs to the draughty second bedroom, the window of which faced the field beyond the slimy ditch. My heart was still beating too fast as I gazed into the moonlight through the old net curtains, looking as far as I could along the road both ways, and then across the sweep of the field, but seeing nothing other than what was being created between moving cloud and the high, bright moon. The store at Thrubend Edge was in the front room of the last house in the terrace. It doubled as a post office, and smelt of dust and staleness. The woman I found in there poked her head forward and stared at me when I walked in. It was unnaturally huge, I explained. Dark. I sensed that she knew perfectly well what I was talking about, and in that dusty room I exchanged one kind of fear for another, which, although no less intense, was no longer so personal. "Well, it's a farming community," she answered, staring at me from head to foot with a kind of country rudeness. "So it's not without him, of course. The coal-black one, I reckon you mean," she said. "My sister told me he was known about here, but I thought I'd make sure," I replied. "That's been about a lot more since her by the chicken farm came. It's even been spotted in the village." She smiled at me briefly. "For a moment I thought you was her, but you don't dress the same." "Liz is my twin," I explained. "She never said about a twin," the postmistress declared, as if somehow Liz had betrayed the village for not revealing it. "You gave me a shock when you walked through the door. I thought it was her pretending to be somebody else, to trick us." "Liz doesn't want to trick anyone," I said quickly. The postmistress shrugged. "The church warden might like to talk to you. He should be about the church right now." And with that, she turned her back on me so abruptly that I gasped and stood for a moment motionless. As I made my way towards the church, I ran through the same cyclical thoughts about my sister that had been with me for years, and felt the familiar old anger, all bound about with pity, that I could never quite rid myself of. I decided I'd leave Thrubend Edge as soon as I could, and never return. Mother would have to deal with Liz by herself. The yew tree at the lich gate had shed its load. There were thousands of fleshy cup-like berries scattered on the path, some crushed and slimy, and those freshly fallen with a black seed like a tongue poking repulsively from their ends. I avoided them and made my way between the gravestones. The warden was the sorriest-looking guy I'd seen for a long time, and in the city you can hardly go 2 steps without seeing sorry-looking men. He was not pleased to find me there, and strode towards me, waving his hands in the air. The woman in the post office said I should come here. She was mistaken to do so. You have no relatives buried in Thrubend. He looked sideways without moving his head, as if checking the gravestones for signs of vandalism. I'm staying at the house that stands by itself back along the way. He glanced over his shoulder at the church door and bit his lip. I thought you were someone come here by accident. Car broke down or something. My sister's been here for a little while now. Ah, of course, I see. Miss Marchland, that'll be. That's right. Do you know her? Everybody knows her, he said, and left an idea hanging in the air between us that alarmed me slightly. Has she done something strange? I asked. He shrugged. It's not her fault she's chosen, I suppose. Leastways, you can't tell if there's something about a person that makes it so. Could be any one of us. Yes, it could be any one of us, you're right, but chosen isn't the word I'd use to describe it. It's kind of you, though. She might be all right. She says she is all right. Feeling a lot better. I mean, her not being from here might make her safe. I know what you've come for, you see. I sensed that he did, and the trickling of fear I'd felt in the post office gathered strength. In that case, have you seen him around here? Not yet. I'll have that pleasure before the day is through, though. He hangs about in Liz's house, then suddenly isn't there. The warden shifted and looked at his watch. I can't talk to you outside now. I stared at him hard. You implied that some people aren't safe here. Nobody ever knows who he'll harm and who he won't. He laughed suddenly, and the sound of it hung in the air between us. You don't really see him properly, do you? Am I right? Yeah, I do. He's huge, black and beautiful. Brutal. The real blackness is in his soul. He stared about him once more, as if to catch something out not quite hidden from view. How is your sister really, in your opinion? In love, I said, bluntly. I'd call it enchantment. There's always one. Where does he come from? Hell, the warden replied, under his breath. I'm being perfectly serious. The relationship looks odd to me. It will be odd, yes. And I'm being perfectly serious. Well, what should I do? Persuade her to leave with you. I've tried. Try again. You do think he'll harm her? It depends. Look, come with me now. There's a particular window I watch from. If we're lucky, we'll be able to observe. We stood beside each other and stared through one of the tiny diamond-shaped panes. We had a clear view of the graveyard, and as we waited, I could smell the warden's fear, like a mingling of rust and fungus, half chemical and half organic. Finn came into sight from nowhere, out on a grassy mound close to a group of falling gravestones. I felt something sour fill my mouth and bolt back quickly, leaving it dry like bone. And there, in the silence of the church, I began to acknowledge what I had refused to see before. Even as he drifted, perversely imprinted on the scene, I clung to blatant denial, but as the last remnant of doubt slid out of reach, and I could entice nothing back in support of the rational, I was left with a brutal, raw knowingness of what I was witness to. Something occult and degenerate. Occult and intimate with my twin. His presence warped the surroundings, so things solid faded and skewed. Behind his body I was aware of the trunks of spindly trees, yet his movements bore no natural relationship to them. He seemed at times to exist in mid-air, and at other times to be made of the very earth itself. He lingered and turned his head in our direction, one more time than seemed coincidental. The warden shifted back a step or two, and I heard him hiss, "Move away. He knows you're here." The hound was gone suddenly, and where he'd been had turned to innocent space and light. But I gazed fixedly at it for a long time, as if it could only be a moment before the scene was flooded again with the flat greyish half-light he'd brought with him. When I finally turned round, I saw that the warden was hunched in the front pew. I moved towards him and could not hear the sound of my own feet. I was walking erratically and stopping sometimes, and could not help it. I noticed that the face of the wooden Christ on the altar was desperate, not with sorrowful agony, but raw, primitive terror. I slid into the pew directly behind the warden and stared at the back of his bent neck. "The vicar," is all I could find to say. "Taken. They all are. The last was here less than a 5-month. He threw himself into the drainage ditch, singing like an idiot as he drowned himself. Liz waits for it. She lingers," I whispered. "People say it hunts for soulmates. Since your sister's been here, there have been more sightings. Where I come from is Padfoot. I never did encounter him there all through my childhood. Here, they call him Shuck. He waits at the crossroads, or comes suddenly out of the drainage ditch. He runs in Farrow's field, close to the house Miss Marchland's in." He turned round and studied my face as if it was strange territory, and I knew that having shared the sighting with him meant I would always remember his face in every detail. That I'd been drawn into a hideous mental intimacy with him against my will. "It does not exist," he said. "Tell yourself that." "It does not exist," I whispered back. Liz was standing as I'd left her, at the window in the front room. "Did you find out?" she asked, without turning round. I was glad she couldn't see my face, for I knew it had stiffened. "Nobody in the village has ever heard of him," I said. "That's of no significance," she answered, and shifted from foot to foot. "You never saw him then?" My journey back to the house had been so clouded and dense with fear that I can scarcely remember the walk. "No, I never saw him." I stared at her back, willing her to believe she had created him herself, and she could as easily abandon him. "Where did you go to look, Eric?" I'd heard the heavy labouring beat of my own heart all the way through the village and down the way, and the sound of it increased my terror, for I needed all my senses clear if the gigantic hound were to manifest itself before me from the ditch, the hedgerow, the very earth itself. I was running, half doubled over, aware of a sobbing whine that came from my throat. My fingers were bunched together, wet and trembling as I ran. "Where do you think I should have gone, Liz?" I asked. "To the churchyard," she whispered. "I did. I waited there a long time." "I don't believe you." Every second I'd expected the apparition to halt me on the road. I knew for certain it had been aware of my presence in the church. "I met the warden there. He said I was quite mad. There is no big dog thing like that." Liz turned round slowly. I couldn't see her face properly against the yellowing light from the window. "You saw him yourself here," she answered, simply, not raising her voice. As I got to the house and stopped for a second to calm myself, the rooks in the field rose as a single entity, soundless, and headed for the tree on the horizon. I saw what you saw, Liz, and that's because I love you, miss you. Why don't you come home with me? She shuffled towards me then, and as she put her arms around me, I was both repelled and glad. Why don't you get dressed properly, and we'll go home? You've only got one sock on. Isn't your other foot cold? You did see him when he came here, didn't you? I saw what was in your mind's eye. It's because we're the same people, she whispered. Sometimes I hate you because of it, and sometimes I know really that I am you. And that's why I keep thinking things will be all right in the end. Because you cope with everything, Erica, I mean. Come back with me. Even as I said it, I knew she'd refuse. The dog isn't real, you know. I left the next morning, very early. Liz was already up. She'd torn the wallpaper off around the frame of the window. Ragged pieces of it lay curled at her feet. She didn't say goodbye. There is no mystery man, Mum. She invented him. An imaginary friend. She's had them before, remember? I knew you'd say that, but Elizabeth told me all about it. She phoned me in the middle of the night. She was sobbing pitifully. She said he'd gone. And don't tell me you're blameless in this, Erica. I moved the phone away from my ear to make her voice feeble, and wondered if madness is always a grotesque tango between two people, one luring the other to dance, and the other always going gladly. A hideous combination of the ignorant and the rigid. You might sneer at Liz's need for a special friend, our mother said, but it's perfectly normal. Normal, which is more than can be said for me, I whispered, echoing the old refrain before she could do it herself. I can't keep the ordinariness of things around me anymore. I feel as if there's nothing much solid about the physical world, and nothing innocent. As if what separates things normal from those occult is so flimsy that at any moment terrifying change could occur. I see the warden at the oddest times. The image of his face is lodged behind my eyes, and it comes to me repeatedly and suddenly. He mouths the words, "The thing does not exist," and I repeat it like a child, out aloud, like a mantra. Yet it was with him, a stranger, that I came to see it fully. I am trapped in a hideous limbo, in which I both accept and deny the thing. I know how it must feel to be Liz when I can persuade myself that I did step through some foul portal towards her, and take her in my arms, and share her madness. But we do not talk about the dog. I dare not ask her to describe it to me, in case our visions match. I visit her regularly, but don't stay overnight. I take her supplies and clean her house up. She lives for the return of Shuck. She barely functions and hardly ever gets dressed. The garden's gone to coarse tangles, and rampant grass grows everywhere about. She wanders up and down the way, and across the chalky field, calling the black dog incessantly. Of course, she blames me for its disappearance, believes that if I'd never come, he'd be with her still. She says it's because we're twins. She says I've always taken her luck away, sucked it out of her. And if she is right, then I should wait for the companionship of Shuck myself. Today's story was Shuck. by Rebecca Lloyd. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. Well, I do hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, sweet dreams